Hey everybody, Mike here from The Art of Guitar, here with the video that I've been trying to do for over 6 months now. I just wanted to make sure it was going to be right, so I had to go back and watch it a couple of times. So that means I watched this documentary for 16 hours in order to make this video. But the first time I watched it, I thought it'd be so cool to make a video of my own and talk about the main lessons and the main points that I got from it. So first off, I wanted to gauge where each band member was mentally, their state of mind. George seemed pretty laid back, he's smoking a cigarette, and everybody's setting things up in this big sound stage area. And George seemed more curious than anything, sort of like, I don't know what's going to happen here, but I'm ready for it. And Ringo was just chilling behind the kid, of course, being himself, just really, calm and cool and ready for whatever. He's one of those band members that you really appreciate because he's willing to do whatever you need him to do. He's not necessarily there to make the calls, but he was just sitting there ready for action, it seemed. And it was hard to tell where John was at. This whole documentary kind of surprised me because I didn't realize, at least at this stage of his life, how up and down he could be. So there are times when he's laughing and joking, and then the next scene he looks really depressed and bored, like he wants to be somewhere else. And then we have Yoko Ono sitting next to him, so it was kind of hard to tell where he was at. And the last person to show up was Paul McCartney. It's like he made his grand entrance, but it was funny because the other guys were already jamming, and they didn't really stop to be like, hey, Paul's here, or anything like that. So Paul just walked in, just like another band member like he was at the time, and just took a seat, and then all four of them were there, and it just felt like, here we go, this is the complete package. Now we're ready to do something. The first lesson that I really realized from this documentary is how important deep roots can be. This whole documentary is just full of them all jamming on either old songs of their own, but mostly of cover songs. Back in the day, they used to play for several hours a day back in the Cavern days. And so somebody once said 8 hours a day. And I thought that's pretty incredible. I'm sure they repeated a lot of songs, maybe. But to have that sort of library, those sort of deep roots are so important for a band. And you can see the results of it. There originals that sprung from all those songs have very deep musical roots, and you could feel it, you could hear it, you could just sense it. That might be a big reason why the Beatles were so great, is because each of them had so many influences. You look at bands, that maybe didn't have as deep of a pool to choose from. Take a band, this is an extreme example, but have you ever heard of the Shags before? It's a group of daughters. This is just the story that I heard. And I guess their dad wanted them to be rock stars or whatever, so he bought them all instruments and kind of locked them in the basement and said, come up with something. And they hadn't really listened to music before. They weren't sure what they were doing, and the result sounded like this.
My pal's name is Foot. I never find him home.
Now, I'm not saying it's horrible. A lot of people would, but it's interesting to me. I think of having deep roots as having a huge toolbox. So whenever you need something, let's say you're writing a song and you come to the middle part, you just aren't sure what to do. Well, you have all those tools to dig from, and usually you're going to find something that's going to fit. The second thing I learned from this documentary is that fame and success can be a double-edged sword, like most things. It seems great on the surface. They walk in, they have fur coats, they have fancy cars. There are girls waiting for them to show up at the studio just to catch a glimpse of them. They walk in and everyone's pretty much serving them. So if they need something, they just ask, and all of a sudden someone's right there with, a glass of white wine, or they seem to really enjoy toast. And especially cigarettes. They were always smoking. That's one thing I noticed in this documentary. Somebody always has a smoke in their hands. Now, that's not to say that they were too big to do the dirty work. Even though they had all these people serving them, if you want to think of it as serving them. But, one time I remember John Lennon actually helped them pull the organ off of the truck into the studio. And that thing looked really bulky and really heavy. And I thought that's so cool that a guy like John Lennon, who at the time must have been a millionaire, I'm not sure, but I know he was wealthy at the time, went up and he started to help them carry it in. And that could be a liability. Imagine if John Lennon dropped the organ on his fingers or something, So it was really cool to see him still do the blue collar work, even though they didn't have to. One of the downsides of success is that you might lose a little bit of that drive, that hunger that you had back when you were starving, when you were a starving musician, as they say. And I sensed that a little bit. It's almost like they didn't have to be there in the recording, or in that sound studio, I should say. They were just choosing to do it. I don't know if they had contractual obligations. It really just seemed like they were there sort of just jamming around and just playing around. It didn't seem so focused like I'm sure their earlier recordings were, according to what I've read. I think a boxer once said it's really hard to get up in the morning and start running when you're sleeping in silk sheets. And of course, success brings a lot of attention. They kept showing them reading newspapers that were gossip rags, I guess. And they were talking about how some of the Beatles were fist fighting and making up stories. So it's a lot like what's online these days, except back then it was in the newspapers and magazines. And just because you have a lot of money doesn't mean things don't go wrong. It was really interesting to see them still struggle with very basic things like George Harrison getting electrocuted by his microphone, recording gear going bad. They had to take a lot of breaks just so Glenn Johns could get everything back in working order. And they were renting out that soundstage for a set amount of days. So even though they had all the money in the world, there was still a set schedule for them. They still had some confines to kind of play within. The next important point that I learned from this documentary is that without strong leadership in a group, sometimes you're just drifting. Like they say, like a rudderless ship. There's a different vibe when Paul McCartney finally walked in at the beginning of the documentary. It almost felt like, okay, now we can get started. The captain's here. Paul really seemed like the one that had the most vision for what they were going to do. And they mentioned after Brian Epstein died that they were kind of just flailing around. I forgot what they said. I think they said they were in the doldrums for a long time. And it's because really nobody was taking charge. And I was surprised because I thought maybe George Martin would fill that role because everything I read before seemed like he was such an important part of the Beatles. But if you watch this documentary, he's not in it nearly as much as I thought he was going to be. So because he didn't really take that role, Paul McCartney talked about needing a father figure in the band. I guess Paul just stepped up because leadership has a way of finding a person in a group. And sometimes it's the right person, sometimes it's not the right person. When it's not the right person, the wheels can fall off really fast. And I couldn't really imagine anyone else in the band taking the leadership role at this point. John seemed real up and down. It was weird. I was wondering if he was maybe partly bipolar or something. George had his moments of leadership. And there are times when it was his song that they were working on that all of a sudden he would stand up a little taller and he would give direction. And I know he had the leadership skill inside, but he just never really got to use it too much because, you have Paul McCartney and John Lennon sitting right there. It's got to be tough to shine with those people in the same room with you. And I think it'd be hard for Ringo to lead just because he's so chill, so laid back, so willing to do what other people want him to do that I can't really see him in the leadership role. Even in his own band, it's really hard for me to imagine him directing everybody, but maybe I'm wrong. One of the issues that you have to deal with when you're leading a band, though, is that you could easily be despised. All of a sudden, Paul McCartney's given orders and, George didn't take too kindly to it after a while. Back in the old days, I'm sure he just did whatever they told him to do. But now George is starting to come into his own, it seemed, and Paul McCartney's telling him what to do. And it really seemed like George started to resent that a little bit, and it eventually led to him quitting the band. And so that had to have been weird for Paul to experience that. All of a sudden he stands up as a leader, and one of his friends quits the band almost right away. So later, Paul and John have this private meeting, and somehow they snuck a microphone into that room and recorded it, which is really interesting that happened. And John was telling Paul how he thought he was being kind of bossy, and then Paul's like, "That's weird because I always thought of you as the leader, John." And I'm sure back in the early days, they were dual leaders, but because of all the things that transpired, things changed. All of a sudden, John just kind of took a back seat to all that kind of stuff. So that left Paul to take the wheel. And so all the resentments go towards Paul now. So it's kind of this weird dynamic that happened at the time. But like a good leader, Paul understood and he actually changed it up. And so when George eventually came back, spoiler, it was really cool to see that Paul started to relax a little bit. He was trying to be a little more understanding. He wasn't really barking orders. He was just kind of suggesting things, and he was open to suggestions as well, which is cool to see. We all probably know the importance of goals, but we also need discipline and unity in order to really pull it off. Talk about discipline. Think about when they were playing 8 hours a night, playing at that cavern. You see the old video clips of them playing, and it must have been such an education for them. Not only playing all those songs, but having the stamina to just keep going. So not only do you have to know all those tunes, memorize them, but you also have to be able to physically play them for that long. That is not easy to do. I've played in bands that have played for 3 hours in a night, and that is exhausting. I can't imagine playing as long as this entire documentary was, which was 8 hours long. So they had been jamming a lot up into this point, and Paul finally had the realization, being the leader, he's like, guys, we need to have a goal. We need to accomplish something every day. And their initial goal was pretty intense, and I wonder if it just freaked him out because it was supposed to be 14 songs in 14 days, ending in some kind of big show or something. And they all knew that was looming, but instead of really just driving to get it done and get ready for that, they were just jamming around too much. And Paul knew this. And then they started to really find direction at that point. But the problem was that the goal was a little too big. And because they all seemed a little bit mentally volatile because of that huge idea, the huge elephant in the room the whole time, it didn't push him in a good direction. It actually kind of made them fall apart a little bit. So that's something really important, is when you do make a goal, don't make it so massive that you paralyze yourself. You have to learn to be a little bit flexible when it comes to that kind of stuff. And because their work ethic changed and they really started to gain momentum, having an end goal seemed a lot more realistic. And so that's when they started to throw around ideas, and eventually they came up with that rooftop idea. Speaking of unity, it was the first time that all four of them agreed on something. So when the rooftop idea came up, the three guys were like, yeah, that sounds cool. And then Ringo was the last one they asked, and he's like, yeah, I really want to play on the roof. And that finally clinched it. You know, it's something very powerful about unity. So when you're in a group of any kind and you have a unified goal in mind, it's scary how powerful that can be. So vibe and chemistry are so important. When they first go to that soundstage in the beginning, it's like this gigantic Hollywood soundstage looking thing. It was very impressive looking, but it wasn't very conducive to them being creative. And it was really wild to see them all sitting there with all these cameras around them. And, Yoko Ono sitting there. There's all these things happening, and it just didn't feel right. And Paul McCartney talked about that. He's like, it's real hard to do anything with all these cameras in my face. And right away, George was talking about how the acoustics were just off. So it was really hard to create a vibe in such a wide open space. That's why it was so cool when they finally up and moved to the other studio, because instantly it felt better. It was smaller. And they started to play the songs and feel each other a little bit better, it seemed like. So they'd play the same song over and over again, and they would just wait for that right take. And it's really cool when at the bottom the text would say, this is the actual version that went on Let It Be, the album. And so it was cool to see it actually come together and, pardon the pun, come together. There was just a different feeling when they went to the smaller studio. So sometimes capturing that vibe is about atmosphere. Sometimes it's about the right people. And speaking of people, when Billy Preston finally came in, the whole vibe changed for the better. So they were doing pretty well. You know, they were being very consistent, but they still seemed like they were missing something, some sort of glue. And so when they brought Billy Preston in to play the keys, all of a sudden it felt like everything was finally in sync. Everything was glued together. And you could just tell by their faces. They're all smiling. They're like, I can't believe this is sounding so good. Because Billy Preston's a master musician. He just comes in, he starts playing exactly what the music needed for the keys, at least. And of course, Billy Preston's always smiling, so that's really contagious. So it's like bringing in good vibes into the situation that was already pretty good, but it got even better. And chemistry has nothing to do with proficiency. So you could get a room full of awesome musicians, take four of them, put them together, and be like, this is going to be a super group. And the magic just won't be there. For some reason, chemistry is tricky like that. Now, the vibing really happened the most, in my opinion, on the rooftop, when it was finally the big performance, because they're all up there together, unified. It's kind of them against the world in a weird way, because they're on the rooftop and all these people are kind of outside wondering what's going on. But they had the police coming upstairs. They were standing behind them. So there was just this feeling of danger as they were doing it. So it's like, I can't believe we're doing this, you guys. And they're unified up there. They're vibing. The music sounds great. They even used a couple of the takes from the rooftop on the actual album. I thought that was pretty incredible. The next part I want to talk about is how tricky the creative muse can be. It could seem to come out of nowhere. And one of the most incredible scenes that I could think of in the documentary was where Paul is sitting there and Ringo and George are just sitting there kind of hanging out. And Paul's just jamming. And it seemed like just normal messing around sort of stuff. But then all of a sudden you hear little bits of a song that's very familiar, which is Get Back. And it was really amazing to see it happening right before your eyes. So Paul's just doing this real, standard jam in A. It's kind of like this blues sound. And next thing you know, he's just sort of mumbling. And it's almost like he became imbued with a spirit of some kind. Like it just started happening and coming out of him. And you could tell the other two guys could feel it too, because all of a sudden Ringo starts tapping along. And then George starts to kind of hum along too. And Paul knew something special was happening. You could tell because his eyes lit up. Next thing you know, he's coming up with a huge part of the chorus to Get Back. Actually, I think it was the verse. Probably both. I'll have to go back and watch it a third time. Creativity can take courage as well. I think about Ringo writing a song and having to bring it to guys like, George, Paul, or John. It's got to be really intimidating, but he still did it. And look at the results. I mean, he wrote Octopus's Garden, which ended up on a masterpiece like Abbey Road. So if you're not brave with your creativity, you end up going the safe route. And that never really seems to lead to really good art. I think of that scene from The Office where Pam draws a picture of Dunder Mifflin, the building. And that one guy who I hated at the time, but he was right. He said, yeah, I just don't feel it. It just seems safe. It seems like hotel art. The documentary also taught me a lot about distraction and how there's actually two sides to it. So on one side, you have the bad distractions. So the ones that take away from what you're trying to do. So whether it's cameramen in your face, there's always a microphone that seemed to be dangling over everybody. That had to have been really distracting. Imagine writing a song or doing anything creative and having all these eyes on you all the time. And ears. Yoko was always sitting there, like right away in the beginning of the documentary. It was really weird when Paul walked in. I thought, okay, now the guys are there. Yoko's going to get up and do something else, but she just sat there the entire time. And you could kind of tell it got to Paul a little bit, but over time, they all just surrendered to it. They're just like, she's going to be there. Let's just do this. So they learned to kind of work around her. Now, the other side of that is that I think Yoko was a calming presence for John and kept him, in a good headspace. So in a way that helps the whole band, because if John is in a bad headspace, I can't see anything getting done. So maybe it's good that she sat there the whole time. I don't know. But then they had weird distractions, like some actor came in and just decided to hang out for a while, and they talked awkwardly. And then after a while, he's just like, okay, well, I gotta go. And I thought, what was the whole point of that? That was really weird. And there was also this Hare Krishna guy sitting in the corner, like this monk dude just meditating. And, he wasn't in anybody's way, but I thought that'd be really weird if you're trying to be creative and trying to write songs and you look over and there's just some dude meditating in the corner. I don't know. I think that would have thrown me off. And we all know about Yoko and her scream singing. I always think of that Chuck Berry scene where, he heard her for the first time and made that face. But I think when her and John were doing that primal scream therapy, it actually was a benefit just for John's mind state, not necessarily for his vocal cords, but I think that relieved a lot of stress for him, so that was a good thing, I guess. We have to talk about the importance of fun and humor. Even though there were a lot of serious situations in the documentary, the whole thing is basically just littered with funny moments. So, John was hilarious. He's always making jokes. They were singing, I've Got a Feeling. And then John would say something like, I've got a heart on. And they would laugh. They would just do goofy things. Like even towards the end where they were going to go on the rooftop, you could tell people were a little bit nervous. But then he and Paul McCartney did this thing where they sang together. I think they were singing Two of Us. And they made these like really crazy faces and just locked eyes and tried not to move their mouths as they sang, and it just brought some levity to the situation. And since they've known each other for so long, they have these weird inside jokes, and I could relate to that. In my old band, we had so many moments together that we could say one word and we'd all start cracking up. So that was a huge, glowing, positive part of this documentary, is just hearing them joke around, and then you leave with a good feeling inside. You're just like, they had fun, even though things got serious, and you know how things eventually end. At least when they were together, they still had it in them to joke around like they were teenagers again. You have to realize, too, that tension, setbacks, and arguments are inevitable whenever it comes to any kind of a group endeavor. I think the most tense part of the whole documentary is when George and Paul kind of butt heads a little bit, and George eventually just kind of gives in. He's like, hey, I'll play what you want me to play, or if you don't want me to play, I won't play. That's when I think Paul was kind of confused. He's like, man, I'm kind of the leader here, and I'm already getting this pushback. And the tension remained during that weird hidden microphone scene where they just showed the dialogue, basically, and it's because it was with two former best friends arguing with each other. And I've had this experience as well. There's just some resentment that builds up, and you could hear them letting it out a little bit. So that was a hard thing to kind of listen to, but it was really important that they talked it out. In my situation, we didn't talk it out, and it just made the band implode. So I think the Beatles lasted a little bit longer because they were able to talk through it in most cases, I guess. And the way they were recording, how they were trying to get the perfect take, so they would do it over and over and over again, that's inevitably going to lead to some tensions. Because let's say you get the perfect take, but somebody messes up one part of it, you get a little bit impatient sometimes. Like if you're in the studio and you're on a budget, which they weren't, it didn't seem, but they were on a time crunch, and somebody keeps messing up, it's easy to sort of lose your temper and just get a little bit frustrated with each other. And everybody deals with that stuff differently. For example, whenever they had a group meeting, you could see Paul sort of drift off. He had like this 1,000-mile stare sometimes. And I wonder if that was a way for him to deal with conflict. It always seemed like he wasn't quite there. Like he would put in his 2 cents, but then he would drift off again. And it was something really interesting to see. Sometimes when you think of music and bands, you don't want to think of competition. Sometimes you want to leave that for sports teams. But when it comes down to it, sometimes it could be a very healthy thing. You could tell, they're up there with the Beach Boys and the Rolling Stones, and they would would mention them sometimes, but sometimes it had this feeling like they were in this competition with them. And I think that was a good thing because what that does, especially if you're at a certain age, is it makes you work harder to make yourself better. Not that you always want to beat everybody, but you want to keep up with people, you want to do your best, you want to shine amongst the other bands. So I think that's where competition can be really healthy. It worked for my old band when we were teenagers. We wanted to be the best band in our school, for example. And then you could have the inner competitions too. So for example, John and Paul trying to outdo each other in songwriting, that really helped them out early on, especially when they're really trying to write the best song. So it's like this ladder that they both climbed. And even though they're maybe competing against each other, they're still on the same team. They're still on the same ladder in the end. Even at that time, after all that competition that they did early on, John would be struggling to hit a high note, for example, when they're jamming, and then Paul would just easily do it. And I thought that had to eat at John a little bit, just knowing his personality. And he's probably like, I'm going to show you. And then the next scene, you could tell John was putting a little extra effort into his vocals. So I think Paul was a good thorn in his side in a good way, a good thorn. And I'm not sure if George cared about the competition, but when you're in, a pool full of sharks like that, you have to learn how to swim really fast. And so maybe some competitive drive was in him, and he's like, I'm going to write such a great song. It's undeniable. And I keep talking about Abbey Road. Look what ended up happening. I mean, he wrote Here Comes the Sun and Something, two of my favorite songs, and they're on Abbey Road, and they're both from George Harrison. So I really think that shows that some healthy competition can be really great for songwriting. The only person who didn't seem to thrive on competition was Ringo. Like I keep saying, he's just this laid back, calming force in the band. I shouldn't say force, maybe a spirit in the band. And he just sat back there and did his thing. He never seemed to be worried about anyone taking his job. He never seemed to be worried about writing the best song. So who knows? Maybe in the end, he was the most zen guy. And I touched on this a little bit earlier about the rooftop scene when the cops started to come up. Eventually, you start to feel like, okay, now we have enemies. Even though I'm sure they could have easily just paid the cops off or whatever, but still, there's a little bit of danger in that. Like they could have maybe spent the night in jail. Who knows? But when they're coming up, it's like this feeling of adversity. It's like, okay, it's us against them. And it made them play with a little more vigor, I think. A huge lesson learned from this documentary is that you're more than just your band. Now, I already knew this being in a bunch of bands in my life, but sometimes you look at a group and you think of the members in the band, but you could forget about the whole team that's around them. That's why I think the song With a Little Help from My Friends is very applicable here, because without the whole team around them, the Beatles might not have come close to where they ended up. We talked about Brian Epstein in the beginning and how important he was to the Beatles, and when he was gone, suddenly the captain of the ship is not there anymore, and how they sort of just floated around for a long time until Paul finally took over. And then, of course, you had George Martin. And Glenn Johns, surprisingly, did most of the heavy lifting in this documentary. And I say surprisingly because I didn't know he was that important to the Beatles until I saw it. He was always making sure everything was working in the control room. He was telling, the band members to adjust their instruments, which I thought was really interesting. He was there to give advice. He was talking about the walk down part and Let It Be. And he actually came up with the melody of the walk down after the chorus. I thought that was really interesting to see. Seemed like he had a lot of guys coming in and out of the control room just to kind of check things out, but it was really interesting to see Alan Parsons there. He's just sitting back there kind of like, who's that guy, Skarsgård or whatever from It. I don't know why he was giving me those It vibes. And then during their full band discussions, you could really tell it was a team effort because like Mal Evans, I believe, is the one who came up with the rooftop idea. You also have to remember that it took a lot of work to archive all this footage. Without it, this wouldn't exist. I couldn't believe all the detailed footage they had. So somebody had to capture the footage, keep track of it, write it down, make sure they kept track of everything. A lot of old footage gets destroyed over the years. So it was amazing that all this stuff still existed. And the little things you might not think about, and I didn't think about it first, is after they played the rooftop, the band just got to go back inside. But there was a whole team that had to take down all the gear, collect all the recording stuff, bring it in, make sure everything was safe, pay off the police. I don't know what they did. But there's a whole cleanup effort that had to happen after that. And the last thing I'll talk about is appreciating what you have while you have it. It's really easy to think of the past, which I do a lot these days, by the way, or look forward to the future and forget about what's happening right in front of you. And I know it's really kind of trite to say now, like live in the moment, but it's because it's such a profound thing. I don't want to just skim over it. It really started to hit me after the rooftop scene because at the bottom it said, this is the last Beatles live performance. And who knows, while they're up there, they may have been enjoying it. But, I'm sure they're more thinking, God, it's cold up here. My amp just shut off. What are we doing? And next thing you know, it's done. and it's over, and that was their last performance, and you missed it. And there's just a rare magic that happens when you're in the moment, and it's something that's really hard to explain. I mean, when you're in the zone and you're feeling it, that's when you experience that magic the most. That's why after the show, there's such a buzz, such a great feeling. That's why it was so cool to see them all in the control room after the rooftop scene, because they were listening to the playback and they were all excited. They're like, I can't believe we pulled this off. And there's a real camaraderie in that. You know, whenever you do something together and you pull it off, you're kind of like in battle together. There's just something that you look back on and you're like, that was a real special time. And as you get older, you know, people start dropping off and you have 4 people in the band. Next thing you know, someone's gone. And that's a fourth of your band disappeared just overnight. That's why it was so chilling when George quit the band and then John wasn't showing up. When Paul said, just, he looked really depressed. He's like, and then there was 2. Especially when you think of after this documentary, how years later, John Lennon gets assassinated and then George dies. And then there really was only 2. Hopefully you like this video. Thank you for watching. It's a longer video, so thank you for everyone who stuck with me till the end, and we'll catch you at the next video. Thanks. Bye-bye.